Once again, quarterback is the biggest question plaguing the Denver Broncos as we enter the 2022 league year. Hello everyone, welcome to the Sparkin Over Broncos Podcast, the show where we spark conversation about our Denver Broncos. I am your host, Gage Madrid. Denver Broncos General Manager George Paton expressed the team's clear desire to upgrade at quarterback when asked about the position at the 2022 NFL Combine, having this to say.
I think it's always a priority. It's the most important position in sports, so we're always looking. We do have Drew Lock under contract. We have Rip in reference to Broncos third-string quarterback Brett Rippon, but we're always looking. No stone unturned to find that guy. We know we need better play out of the quarterback position, so we're going to be aggressive.
If you read into what Peyton said there, it's very clear that the team knows that they can't go into 2022 with Drew Lock as the only option. He uses the word aggressive when describing the team's approach to upgrading the quarterback room this offseason. Of course, a large sector of Broncos country hopes that aggressive equates to the team trading for Packers quarterback Aaron Rodgers or Seahawks quarterback Russell Wilson. Unfortunately, as more and more time goes on, it's starting to seem like those two quarterbacks are going to remain with their respective teams, so that leaves one big question for the Denver Broncos. Do they look towards free agency, the draft, or the trade market to potentially solve their quarterback problem? But before we get into that, a couple of housekeeping matters to attend to. We are trying to grow this community and include as many people in the conversation as possible, so a like on this video would be greatly appreciated. It would really go a long way. And if you would like to add to this conversation, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. I would love to interact with you. And speaking of interactions, be sure to follow me on Twitter at Gage Madrid NFL for more coverage of our Denver Broncos as well as the NFL in general. And with that out of the way, let's get into the rest of the video.
So here we have 6 quarterbacks who are scheduled to be free agents, and I have them ranked in the order of how intrigued I would be by the signing. So in the left-hand column, I have the player name, ranking, and what team they were on last season. Middle column, I have their age entering the 2022 season. And in the right-hand column, I have their projected 2022 earnings according to Pro Football Focus. So starting off at number 6, we have a player who, in my opinion, is by far the least intriguing option on this list, and that is Andy Dalton, formerly of the Chicago Bears, Dallas Cowboys, and Cincinnati Bengals. He's going to be entering his age 34 season next year, and Pro Football Focus has him projected to make $7.25 million next season. Now, personally, Andy Dalton is someone who is not very inspiring at all. He's very much the last resort, in my opinion. I'd almost rather re-sign Teddy Bridgewater, who Pro Football Focus has projected to make $8.5 million next year. For just a little bit more money, I feel like it would be quite a significant upgrade. Now, some good things you can say about Andy Dalton are, of course, he has been a starter in the league for a long time. He was the Cincinnati Bengals starting quarterback from 2011 to 2019, leading them to multiple playoff appearances, of course, never winning any playoff games. Dalton's best season by far as a Bengal came in 2015 when he led the team to a 12-4 record. Unfortunately, he did suffer a thumb injury in the second to last game of the season and was unable to play in the playoffs. Some good things you can say about Andy Dalton. Of course, he has been a starter in the league for a long time. He has displayed the ability to operate an offense at a decent, competent level. I mean, he is an okay game manager, but at this point in his career, I feel like he's a lot more on the lower tier, very lower tier starter to high tier backup. I think a good comparison to him at this point in his career is Case Keenum. Of course, in the 2020 season, he did start a majority of the games for the Dallas Cowboys when Dak Prescott went down due to injury, and I thought overall he played okay. The defense on the team was absolutely atrocious, so he was always, it seemed like, playing from behind, but I feel like he did operate the Cowboys offense at a decent level. And then, of course, last season, he parlayed that into a one-year deal with the Chicago Bears, who were using him as a bridge to rookie Justin Fields. Now, faced with pressure from ownership and the fan base, Fields was put in too early, in my opinion. Now, Dalton did start some games down the line for the Bears after being benched for Justin Fields due to an injury to Fields, and quite frankly, the Bears' offense as a whole was frankly incompetent between poor play calling from Matt Nagy and shaky quarterback play all around. I do feel that Dalton probably was their best quarterback last season. That definitely is not saying much. So at this point in his career, I definitely feel like he's a lot more comparable to a Case Keenum or some along those lines, a lower tier starter, high tier backup. And I think if Dalton wants to continue making hay in the NFL, he may have to do it the same way Case Keenum has, and that is as a backup. And I don't know if $7.25 million is going to be what he ends up making in the open market. I do feel like Dalton could be an option for the Broncos if all of these guys above him on the list fail, quite frankly. But even then, I almost feel like you're better off just rolling with Drew Lock, and hopefully he can lose you enough games to get you in striking position for a Bryce Young or a CJ Stroud in the 2023 NFL draft. Moving on to a player who I feel like is slightly more inspiring than Dalton, but I still feel like would be in the category of a fail-safe if all of the above options failed, and that is former Houston Texans quarterback Tyrod Taylor. Now, Taylor is going to be entering his age 33 season next year, and Pro Football Focus has him projected to earn $5 million. Now, Taylor, of course, has had a very interesting career. He was drafted by the Baltimore Ravens, where he spent his first few seasons as Joe Flacco's backup. Then he ended up going to the Buffalo Bills, where he was their starter from 2015 to 2017, and of course led the Bills to their first playoff appearance since the 1990s. While I do feel like Taylor has played pretty well when he's gotten starting time, unfortunately, in every season since 2018, he has been injured and replaced by a rookie quarterback, and in turn has never gotten his job back. So who knows, maybe that could bode well for the Broncos if they decide to bring in Taylor and bring in a rookie. Maybe that'll guarantee that the rookie will play well. Some voodoo curse thing there. But anyway, Taylor, unfortunately, has dealt with injuries these past few seasons. In 2018, he was brought in to be the bridge quarterback to Baker Mayfield in Cleveland, and due to a, frankly, just overall mess in that situation, he did not win any games and was facing pressure early on from the fan base to be benched for Mayfield. Now, Taylor unfortunately ended up suffering a concussion week 3 against the New York Jets. Mayfield ended up taking over, and the Browns never looked back. He then moved on to the Los Angeles Chargers in 2019, where he spent a year behind Phillip Rivers, and when Rivers' contract expired and he moved on to the Colts, Taylor was in line to be the starting quarterback. Now, the Chargers drafted rookie Justin Herbert with the 6th overall pick in 2020 with the hopes that Taylor would be the starter for a year and would eventually be a bridge to Herbert. Now, unfortunately, we all know how that ended up. In week 1 against the Cincinnati Bengals, Taylor ended up suffering a rib injury, and he played through it, did not come out of the game, but the next week he had to have a pregame injection in order to be able to play. Now, unfortunately, the Chargers team doctor gave Taylor an injection, but he punctured his lung in the process. So Taylor ended up having to go to the hospital and missed the game. Herbert ended up playing very well in that game, and Taylor ended up missing multiple weeks from this punctured lung, and Herbert, of course, ended up going on to win Offensive Rookie of the Year, and Taylor never plays another snap again for the Chargers. Then, of course, last season in 2021, Taylor goes on to the Houston Texans, where he is named the Week 1 starter, plays well in the Week 1 game. They beat the Jacksonville Jaguars. Then, unfortunately, Week 2, yet again, he gets injured against his former team, the Cleveland Browns. Now, rookie Davis Mills came in and played pretty well on a team that absolutely was a mess. They had a revolving door at running back. Ownership's a mess. Another video for another day. Now, when Taylor got healthy, he was given his starting job back. Unfortunately, he was just unable to really make hay on a Houston offense that was absolutely a mess. So they go back to Davis Mills, and frankly, Mills played pretty well. And on a Texans team that has a lot of questions at the quarterback position, I feel like Davis Mills could be given a shot to start next season. So Taylor's going to hit the open market, and while I do feel like he brings some nice things to the table, he makes some of his best plays with his legs. Injuries are a concern, and his arm strength is another concern. I do feel like you just don't see enough big time plays through the air with Taylor. So, I don't know. I feel like, again, if all these guys fail and you can't secure really anyone else, Taylor is a better option than Andy Dalton, certainly, but I think that's probably the best thing he has going for him. So the next 4 players on this list I am a lot more intrigued by than the previous 2. I definitely feel like the margin between Tyrod Taylor and Marcus Mariota is quite wide. So at number 4, we do have Marcus Mariota of the Las Vegas Raiders. He's going to be entering his age 28 season next year, and Pro Football Focus has him projected to earn $8 million. Now, Mariota, of course, was the former number 2 overall pick by the Tennessee Titans in 2015. Unfortunately, he was never really able to establish himself as a dominant quarterback in the league, and in 2019, he ended up losing his starting job in Tennessee to Ryan Tannehill, and ironically enough, it was in a game here in Denver against the Broncos. So he ended up signing a 2-year deal with Las Vegas in the 2020 offseason, and he's spent those last 2 seasons as a backup to Derek Carr. He has gotten some playing time, however, in the past 2 seasons in a Wildcat package, predominantly running like read option plays and stuff along those lines, mostly taking advantage of his high-level athleticism, which is something I definitely feel like Mariota brings to the table. That's really the first thing you can see anytime you watch Marcus Mariota's tape is his legs are his best friend. He would definitely be most effective in a run-heavy offense with a ton of play action, RPOs, read option plays, stuff like that. Mariota is known as a very high-character player. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say anything bad about Marcus Mariota. Like, I heard he's just a very calm dude, always even keel. Unfortunately, he does have some issues. I feel like accuracy is really one of his bigger ones. I mean, you can see arm talent for sure, but definitely he struggles to put the ball where it needs to be. Decision making also a little concerning. It's really the main reason why he lost his job to Ryan Tannehill in Tennessee. And unfortunately, injuries have also played a really big part in the course that Mariota's career has taken. He has suffered a serious list of really bad injuries over the course of his career. In 2016, he ended up breaking his leg. In 2018, he suffered an elbow stinger week 1, and it really plagued him throughout the entire season. Missed multiple games because of it. He re-aggravated it a couple of times down the stretch, and unfortunately ended up having to miss a critical week 17 win and in game against the Indianapolis Colts. That would have clinched the Tennessee Titans a wild card spot. Unfortunately, they finished 9-7 for a second year in a row, and they missed the playoffs with the first year under Mike Vrabel. After he signed with the Raiders, he also had multiple soft tissue injuries that caused him to miss multiple games over the past season, and he wasn't even the starting quarterback. I believe he had a preseason injury in 2020 in practice. There were obviously no preseason games, missed the start of the season, and then in 2021 he ran a read option play on, like, I believe it was one of the first plays of the game, week 1 against the Baltimore Ravens, and he ended up injuring his hamstring on a 31-yard run in that game and missed multiple games as a result of that. So even recently, and he hasn't even started again, Mariota has dealt with some injuries these past couple of years. So I do feel like it would be a concerning signing, but I do feel Marcus would bring a ton more upside than a guy like Tyrod Taylor or Andy Dalton. I do feel that the other 3 guys I have on this list would obviously be better fits, but if we can't land one of those guys, I do feel like Marcus Mariota would be a good guy to maybe push Drew Lock or push a rookie quarterback we may bring in, but that's another video for another day. So next up we have the journeyman quarterback himself, Ryan Fitzpatrick, or as he's more commonly referred to, Fitzmagic or Fitztragic, depending on what day it is. Now, Fitzpatrick is going to be entering his age 39 season, and Pro Football Focus has him projected to make $7 million. Now, there is several interesting angles with the Fitzpatrick signing. Now, of course, he is known as a player who is the ultimate gunslinger. He will take chances downfield, not afraid to throw it into triple coverage. Sometimes he'll make it work brilliantly. Other times it will blow up in his face and it is going to end up in a pick six. That is the type of play that encapsulates Ryan Fitzpatrick as a player. He has been on 9 different teams now, starting for, again, all 9 of them. Most recently, he was with the Washington football team, where unfortunately he only played in 16 snaps before suffering a season-ending hip injury, and that's where a very big part of this comes into play. There is question as to whether Ryan Fitzpatrick will want to play again. I mean, he is 39 years old, and that was a very, very serious injury. I mean, that he may decide, hey, listen, I'm done. I can't take this kind of punishment anymore. Or he may try to overcome the odds and make a comeback. And I feel like if he does try to overcome the odds and make a comeback, Denver would be a very interesting fit for him. I definitely feel he would be legitimate competition for a rookie or for Drew Lock. And quite frankly, I feel like he could bring at least interesting level quarterback play to the Broncos. And if all things work out well, I mean, I could see Ryan Fitzpatrick maybe leading this team to the playoffs. But again, he is coming off of an injury, and there is that very low floor that you are risking when you sign a guy like Ryan Fitzpatrick. He's kind of like Drew Lock. I could honestly see the best case scenario for Drew Lock being a guy like Ryan Fitzpatrick. They're very similar players, honestly. And so Fitzpatrick definitely would be intriguing, but the only reason I have him at number 3 is the injury factor, because there is a legitimate chance that Fitzpatrick may retire. I feel $7 million if he does decide to play again is a very fair number. And Ryan Fitzpatrick, if he does decide to play again, would probably shoot up to number 2 or number 1 on this list. So next up, coming in at number 2, we have yet another former number 2 overall pick, and that is Mitchell Trubisky of the Buffalo Bills. Now, Trubisky, of course, was the number 2 overall pick in the 2017 NFL Draft, and of course, the Bears have received heavy scrutiny for that pick because they traded up in the draft to get him and passed on guys such as Deshaun Watson and Patrick Mahomes in that draft. And Trubisky is a guy who was widely regarded as a bust in Chicago. Very similar to Marcus Mariota, Trubisky was a guy who was never really able to establish himself as an elite player. He does bring some good things to the table, however. His biggest strength is using his legs to create big plays. He does have a big arm, and he's not afraid to show it off. I feel like he'd be most efficient in a West Coast offense that would incorporate a lot of spread-heavy concepts. Some play action would be his best friend. Operating out of the shotgun where he could take off with his legs. Again, I feel like that would be the best fit for Mitchell Trubisky, and that's a very similar offense to what was ran in Buffalo. Now, in Chicago, poor mechanics were his biggest issue. They led to his accuracy issues, which really plagued him, especially in his final 2 seasons there. Downfield accuracy was just absolutely shaky. Same thing with decision making. He was very poor against the blitz, and so last year he ended up signing with the Buffalo Bills on a 1-year deal as a backup to Josh Allen, and he just didn't get a lot of playing time. He did see some time in the preseason and occasionally got in a couple of games last season to mop up duty games where the Bills had blown out their opponent essentially, but So I don't know how well his mechanical issues have been fixed. That's definitely something I want to see after his year under Brian Daboll, because we all know what he did with Josh Allen, because let's face it, Josh Allen's mechanics were a mess when he came out of college, and slowly but surely over time his mechanics began to improve, and that's ultimately what led to Josh Allen taking the big leap that he took. So I'm very curious if that year under Daboll could bode the same for a guy like Trubisky. And frankly, Trubisky may want to continue working with Daboll, and I could see Trubisky going to a place like New York where he could potentially push Daniel Jones in training camp, and even if Jones were to win the job, Trubisky could be that backup fail-safe option, and it could be kind of like a Marcus Mariota, Ryan Tannehill situation like I alluded to earlier. It could be kind of like that in New York. However, if that doesn't happen, perhaps the Broncos could look into signing Trubisky. He is going into his age 28 season next year, and Pro Football Focus has him projected to make $7 million, and I do, again, very similarly to Ryan Fitzpatrick, I feel like Trubisky could bring a lot of upside, and if all things work out well, he could lead this team to the playoffs. He did the same with a loaded Chicago Bears roster in 2018, and he also, the Bears were able to go to the playoffs in spite of Trubisky in 2019, so I definitely feel like he could come in and potentially bring at least competent level quarterback play. And again, it's very similar to Ryan Fitzpatrick, where you are risking a very low floor if you bring in a guy like Mitchell Trubisky. But again, Trubisky is projected to make the same amount of money, but he is 11 years younger than Fitzpatrick. So I feel like Trubisky would probably be the better signing than Fitzpatrick, but I feel like a legitimate argument could be made for either one of those guys. I definitely feel Nathaniel Hackett would maybe be able to do some interesting things with a guy like Trubisky. We saw what Hackett was able to do with Blake Bortles in 2017, where essentially he was able to kind of get Bortles out of the way in the offense, and the offense ran through a ground and pound style of attack with Leonard Fournette, and occasionally Bortles would chuck up deep balls to guys like Dede Westbrook and Keelan Cole, speed guys like that. And I feel like maybe Hackett could do something similar with a guy like Trubisky. So I definitely feel like Trubisky would be an interesting signing if he does not go to the Giants, which I feel like are very much the number one team in play for Trubisky. So coming in at number one on the list of free agent quarterbacks I feel the Broncos could target, we have famous Jameis Winston of the New Orleans Saints. Now, Winston, of course, was the former number one overall pick back in 2015 of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and we can definitely say talent is not a question with Jameis Winston. He can make any throw asked of him. He's a very high-level athlete, but his biggest gift is also his greatest enemy. He is very, very volatile. That is the number one word you use to describe Jameis Winston. He will put the ball in harm's way all the time. That was encapsulated fully in 2019, his final season in Tampa Bay, where he threw for over 5,000 yards, did throw for 30 touchdowns, and also threw for 30 interceptions. That is the Jameis Winston experience through and through. Now, in 2020, he signed with the New Orleans Saints on a one-year deal and then re-signed with them last offseason after the retirement of Drew Brees, where he was named the starter over Taysom Hill in a quarterback competition. And frankly, I feel like Winston played pretty well. The Saints were 5-2, and then he goes down with a torn ACL against his former team, the Buccaneers. And that's one of the biggest question marks with Winston, is where is he with his injury? A torn ACL is obviously one of the worst injuries a football player can suffer, and no two torn ACLs are the same. So we're not quite sure what his timeline is. Is Jameis going to be ready for week one? Now, Jameis, in my opinion, is highly likely to re-sign with the New Orleans Saints. Now, again, if he does hit the market, he definitely brings the highest ceiling of anyone on this list, but he also is the guy who has the most question marks. So if you were to sign Jameis Winston, he will be entering his age 28 season next year, and Pro Football Focus, he will sign a one-year deal worth $7 million, but it will be incentive-based because of his injury. So he could earn up to $12 million with incentives next year, according to Pro Football Focus's projected contract. And I feel like that would be a very intriguing signing. Again, I don't necessarily know if Jameis Winston is going to leave New Orleans, because I feel like that's the best fit for him by a long shot, but I do feel Jameis Winston brings a lot of good things to the table, from his arm talent to his athleticism to his leadership. Overall, I felt like his decision-making greatly improved in New Orleans. So if Jameis Winston does hit the open market, I feel like he would be one of the more intriguing options for the Denver Broncos. Moving on to players whose names have been floated around as potential trade targets for the Denver Broncos, and just because a player is on this list doesn't necessarily mean I think they will even be traded or I think the Broncos should trade for them, but their names have been floated around in the media as potential trade targets. Now, in the left-hand column, I have the player name and their current team. I have their age entering the 2022 season. And then on the right-hand column, I have their 2022 salary if they are traded. So that is the number that their new team would have to take on in the event that they get traded. So first on this list, and the player who is almost guaranteed to not be on their current team next season, and that is Jimmy Garoppolo. Now, Garoppolo, of course, was a former second-round pick in the New England Patriots out of Illinois State back in 2014, and he was a guy who was potentially regarded among New England media and the NFL media in general as a potential successor to Tom Brady. Of course, he ended up starting 2 games in place of Brady in 2016 when he was suspended for the Deflategate scandal, and he ended up suffering a shoulder injury in game 2 of that 4-game suspension, so he only played in 2 of those games, and honestly looked really good. And he ended up getting traded to San Francisco after potential reports that Tom Brady went to Robert Kraft and demanded the trade because Belichick wanted to roll with Garoppolo, but that's a different story for a different day. He was traded to the 49ers in the middle of the 2017 season, where he became their starting quarterback for the last 5 games and actually led the team to a 5-0 record. Then in 2018, he ended up getting injured in week 3, tearing his ACL versus the Kansas City Chiefs, and missed the rest of the season. Returning in 2019, Garoppolo actually played pretty well. He ended up leading San Francisco all the way to the Super Bowl, where unfortunately probably one of the most infamous plays of his career happened. He airmailed Emmanuel Sanders on a deep post that would have pretty much iced the game against the Kansas City Chiefs, and then Patrick Mahomes goes on to come back and win the game, and it was a big knife in the heart for 49ers fans. Now, Garoppolo in 2020 was hampered the entire season by a high ankle sprain and only played in a handful of games, and in those games you could definitely tell he was struggling, so it was a completely lost season for Garoppolo in 2020. And as a result of pretty much a history of unreliability, the 49ers traded up in the draft to select Trey Lance out of North Dakota State, number 3 overall. Now, Lance did get some playing time last year in place of an injured Garoppolo and was up and down, honestly, but I do feel like it would be the best interest of the team to move on to Lance as their starting quarterback. So Jimmy Garoppolo is projected to be traded this offseason, and I do feel there are some things Jimmy Garoppolo does well. He's operated most of his career in a West Coast style offense similar to what Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett and offensive coordinator Justin Outen will run. He operates pretty well in the short and intermediate passing game. He does, however, have some major issues. He's usually good for at least one boneheaded decision per play, and it's usually one of those, pardon my French, but Jimmy, what the fuck are you doing type plays. And frankly, they usually come at the least opportune time, usually at a critical moment in the game. He does not have the most arm talent in the world. He doesn't have the strongest arm. He's got a quick release, but his arm strength isn't fantastic, and it will rear its ugly head at times, particularly in the deep passing game. I mean, there are times where he'll throw deep posts in the dirt. Sometimes he'll overthrow them. His accuracy downfield is just wild and crazy inaccurate. So as a result, he tends to miss deep throws on a very consistent basis. And as I alluded to earlier, injuries have also been a concern with Garoppolo. He has only started all 16 games once, and that was in the 2019 season when they went to the Super Bowl. And this past season, more injuries. This past season was no exception to that rule. He suffered a calf injury earlier in the season and missed one game, forcing the 49ers to start Trey Lance. And then, towards the end of the year, he suffered thumb and shoulder injuries, and this is where an interesting angle of this comes into play. It was recently announced that Jimmy Garoppolo is going to have shoulder surgery this offseason, and he's scheduled to miss up to 4 months. So that would put him around the July return timeline, and so that's a little tight for training camp, and he's going to miss OTAs and a lot of offensive install stuff that, quite frankly, is really important. Those are a lot of reps that Garoppolo, frankly, would not get with his new team. And if he is traded next season, he is going to cost $25.5 million against the cap for his new team. That's where I feel a really interesting angle comes into play. I don't know if Jimmy Garoppolo is actually going to get traded. The 49ers may have to release him. I feel like most GMs are going to be smart and patient and not take on what is mostly a bloated whale of a contract and $25 million for a one-year rental for Garoppolo when you don't know what his shoulder health situation is going to be. So I feel like a smart GM would wait for the 49ers to release him and sign him to a much cheaper deal as opposed to having to pay him $25.5 million plus give up a top 100 pick likely in return as compensation. So there is a legitimate chance that Garoppolo may not get traded. An argument made for him to be traded is, of course, what about the market for him? If you let him hit the free agent market, then there's a chance you may miss out on him. Well, personally, I feel like there's only going to be about 3 teams that are going to be strongly in play for Garoppolo, and that is the Washington Commanders, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Denver Broncos. And quite frankly, I feel like George Paton would maybe be okay with willing to gamble on losing out on Garoppolo if there's a chance you could maybe get him at a cheaper deal while getting to keep your draft capital, and maybe you'd use that second or third round pick that you gave up to get Garoppolo on a quarterback or potentially a safety or something along those lines, maybe an edge rusher. You'd be able to fill another need with that draft pick, and maybe you could potentially wait for Garoppolo to hit the open market, and the Broncos have money to throw at him, so maybe you would give Garoppolo a 1-year, $15 million deal or something along those lines. Or something else you could do is potentially ask the 49ers to eat some of Garoppolo's 2022 salary to facilitate a trade. I feel like, honestly, that's a more realistic scenario if Garoppolo were to be traded. But again, I just feel like a smart team will just wait for 49ers to release him and then sign him later. That way, again, you can save the draft pick and get him on a much cheaper ticket, and hopefully you get a 1-year rental for him and hope it works out. So that's what I would be a lot more in favor of George Paton doing if he wants to go the Garoppolo route. I would not be the most excited if he did just flat out trade for Garoppolo coming off that shoulder injury and
all the other injury concerns and concerns just on the field in general. I just don't feel like it would be a good move for the Broncos long term. I feel like you'd just be setting yourself back if you gave up a top 100 pick for Jimmy Garoppolo with all these question marks. Now, obviously, Jimmy's highly regarded as a good dude. I mean, guys in the 49ers locker room love him. The 49ers coaching staff love him. Like, Garoppolo is one of those high character players, but again, I just don't know if he's worth the asking price. Maybe you can, again, be patient and hope his value drops, but if it doesn't, I don't feel like that would be the worst scenario for the Broncos to miss out on the Jimmy Garoppolo sweepstakes. Next up, we have a player who does have ties to George Paton and new Broncos quarterbacks coach Clint Kubiak, but a player who I strongly believe is not going to get traded in Vikings quarterback Kirk Cousins. Now, Cousins is going to be entering his age 34 season, and if he gets traded, his new team is going to have to take on a whopping $35 million cap hit. Now, the Vikings are definitely going to have to figure out a way to lower Kirk Cousins' cap hit. He's owed $35 million plus a $10 million signing bonus for a whopping $45 million against the cap on a 1 year remaining on his contract. That being said, I feel like there are better ways for the Vikings to approach this than to just get rid of him. First of all, Cousins and new Vikings head coach Kevin O'Connell do have familiarity together from their days in Washington when O'Connell was Cousins' quarterback coach. I do feel like Cousins was a big factor in O'Connell coming to Minnesota, quite frankly. And there's a big question of who do you replace Kirk Cousins with if you let him go. Now, the biggest reason why I don't feel the Vikings are going to move on from Kirk Cousins is the glaring question of, are you really in position to upgrade from him? And if not, then who are you going to replace him with? Now, the Vikings do have former 2021 third-round pick Kellen Mond out of Texas A&M on the roster, who does bring some talent to the table, but never got a very ringing endorsement from the previous regime. Kellen Mond never got a very ringing endorsement from the previous regime. In fact, Mike Zimmer kind of went out of his way to crap on him in a press conference. A really low blow, in my opinion. But maybe the new regime with General Manager Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and head coach Kevin O'Connell will view Mond a little bit differently. That being said, I don't feel he would be an upgrade over Kirk Cousins at this point. Cousins is one of the more underrated players in the league, in my opinion. I feel like he gets a lot of unnecessary crap. He does a lot of things well. I don't necessarily feel like Kirk Cousins is a quarterback that's going to win you a championship because you do see him kind of crumble in big moments. But he's not... He does do a lot more things well than he does not well, if that makes sense. Despite all the things Kirk does well, I still feel he is overpaid in a quarterback market that is frankly starved of good quarterback play, and Kirk does bring good quarterback play. I feel like if the Vikings moved on from him, they would really be entering into the pit of misery because you're not going to upgrade from Kirk Cousins at this point. Maybe if you full-blown commit to tanking, but that would involve getting rid of pretty much all of the talent on your roster. And who knows, maybe the Vikings are going to do that. But I feel like Kirk was a major factor in the Kevin O'Connell hire, so he is going to stick around in Minnesota next year. I feel like they're going to figure out some way to lower his cap number. They're going to figure out an extension of some kind, maybe add 1 or 2 years to his deal, maybe a void year at the end of it, so that way it'll distribute some of that cap money down the road, and that way it'll lower his cap hit for the 2022 season. Another idea is maybe they could just potentially approach him, just restructure the deal to remain in Minnesota for 1 more year. That's a potential option. Or they could just let it play out. I don't feel that would be a smart option, but that is something they could do, because at the end of the day, I don't feel the Vikings are going to get
any better at quarterback than what they already have. So it would not be a smart move for them to move on from Kirk Cousins. So while he may be an option for the Broncos, I don't think he's going to land on the market for the Broncos. So I feel like I've discussed Kirk Cousins more than I should have. So moving on. Next up, we have the youngest, cheapest, and in my opinion, most intriguing option on this list in Philadelphia Eagles quarterback Gardner Minshew. Now, Minshew is only 26, and he is by far the cheapest quarterback on this list. If someone were to trade for him, his new team were to only take on a $2.5 million cap hit. Quite frankly, that's a really cheap deal. The reason it's so low is because it's his final year of his 4-year rookie contract. Minshew being a former 6th-round pick of the Jacksonville Jaguars back in 2019. Minshew ended up taking over as the starter for Nick Foles after Foles suffered an injury and frankly never gave the job back up. Minshew provided a really big spark to the team. His energy was awesome. He found a way to win games. And I feel like the Jaguars never really appreciated what they had in Gardner Minshew. I feel like if they had made a more conscious effort to put pieces around Gardner Minshew, he could have really panned out into a really successful quarterback in this league, and I'm still thinking he has a chance to do that at such a young age. Now, the Jacksonville Jaguars ownership, led by owner Shad Khan, was pretty dead set on tanking for the former Clemson quarterback Trevor Lawrence, scheduled to come out in the 2021 draft. Let's just say they successfully completed the mission in 2020, only winning one game that season, and Minshew was, in my opinion, unfairly pulled from his starting job. You could very obviously tell that ownership wanted them to put in the lesser option, first in Jake Luton, then in Mike Glennon, so they would secure the number 1 overall pick. And they tried to save face and say that it was because of an injury, but you could very obviously tell that they were benching Minshew because he was winning them. He would have won them games, and they would have potentially lost out on Trevor Lawrence. It was a really shitty situation, and Minshew ended up getting traded to the Philadelphia Eagles following the 2021 preseason, and he ended up starting 2 games for them in 2021. One of them for an injured Jalen Hurts against the Jets mid-season. The other one when the Eagles rested their starters Week 18 versus Dallas after clinching a playoff berth. And in my opinion, he played really well in those games. He completed 68 of his passes for 439 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 1 interception while posting a 1-1 record. And quite frankly, he really did look good, even though in the Week 18 game when the Eagles had pretty much pulled all their starters out and it was the Eagles practice squad against the Cowboys practice squad who had also clinched a playoff berth. I still feel like Minshew had made some good throws and made some good decisions despite going against basically a skeleton defense with practice squad receivers to throw to. I feel like Gardner Minshew really can play in this league, and Broncos fans should look no further than Week 4 of 2019 when he was with the Jaguars. He ended up leading the Jaguars down 17-6 at halftime to a come-from-behind victory. He finds a way to rally the troops. It would be a very interesting acquisition, in my opinion. I feel like we could maybe offer Philly a 5th or a 6th round pick and maybe allow Minshew to compete with Drew Lock and a rookie, kind of a common theme here, in my opinion. I really feel like if we miss out on Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson, the team is going to dip their toes into this free agent or trade market and maybe bring in a rookie quarterback on the cheap. But if we were to approach it like that, I definitely feel like Gardner Minshew would be the most intriguing option on this list, especially because of his age and his cost, and in my opinion, his upside as well. I feel like Gardner Minshew can definitely play in this league, and I feel like if given the opportunity, he could be a quality starter in this league. So if we were to go in the direction that I feel like the team is going to go, Gardner Minshew is towards the top of my list. Finally, we have another player who, honestly, I doubt anyone is going to trade for, and that is Indianapolis Colts quarterback Carson Wentz, who was going to be entering his age 29 season. Now, if you trade for Carson Wentz, you are taking on a $28.3 million cap hit. That being said, if the Colts were to cut him, they would save $15 million while taking a $13 million cap hit. Ever since Wentz's 2017 season, where he was the MVP frontrunner before tearing his ACL towards the end of the season in a game against the Los Angeles Rams, his career has really been on a volatile downward spiral. He really has regressed as the years have gone on since that season, and it was so much so that in the 2020 draft, the Philadelphia Eagles drafted Jalen Hurts out of Oklahoma in the second round, and this really kind of ended the downward trajectory that ended Wentz's career in Philadelphia, and it really ended on bad terms. You can read into that more online if you want to. It's really a fascinating read, in my opinion. He was then acquired by his former offensive coordinator, Frank Reich, who is now the head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. At the time, was the offensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles, who helped Carson Wentz lead to his All-Pro season in 2017. They were hoping that maybe they could recapture some of that magic in Indianapolis, and unfortunately, that just was not the case. Wentz's play really regressed as the season went on, and despite the Colts having 7 Pro Bowlers and 5 All-Pros on the roster, along with the league's leading rusher and Jonathan Taylor to boot, the season ended on a very sour note. The Colts lost their final 2 games of the season, a loss to the Las Vegas Raiders, and then an embarrassing Week 18 loss to the, at the time, 2-win Jacksonville Jaguars, 26-17. That loss eliminated the Colts from playoff contention. Wentz was a primary culprit in that loss, completing just 59% of his passes for 185 yards, 1 touchdown and 1 interception, plus a lost fumble, and it was really just a horrific ending to the Colts season that just really began to just spiral downhill as time went on. The time that has ensued, Colts general manager Chris Ballard and head coach Frank Reich have been very non-committal about Wentz's future in Indianapolis. Multiple reports from multiple NFL insiders have indicated that the Colts could release Wentz before his 2022 salary becomes fully guaranteed. I personally feel like mentally Carson Wentz is just a broken down player, and I don't know if anyone's going to trade for him, especially at the price that it would take financially to do so. Someone may take a flyer on him if he gets cut, but I'd really be against the Broncos doing so. It's just overall not a very good fit, and I think Carson Wentz's best days in the league are definitely behind him. So I definitely would look elsewhere if I were the Broncos.
Yeah, so definitely not the situation that you want to be in if you're the Denver Broncos. If Rodgers and Wilson don't become available, then you're kind of going to have to pick over some of these duct tape veteran quarterbacks. However, I do feel that there are a couple of options that could be intriguing and could potentially leave the Broncos in a good spot. It's going to be a very interesting decision for Broncos general manager George Paton and head coach Nathaniel Hackett about how they're going to approach the 2022 quarterback market. And of course, we still have the draft angle of it all, but more on who the Broncos could look to draft at quarterback in a future video. So let me know what you think about this situation, Broncos country. How would you approach the quarterback situation if it was your decision to make? Would you make any changes to my list? Let me know in the comments section below. I would love to chat with you. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future content. I would really appreciate it. It would really help me out a ton. And be sure to follow me on Twitter at Gage Madrid NFL. And for now, this has been another episode of the Sparkin Over Broncos podcast, the show where we spark conversation about our Denver Broncos. Peace out.